Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in presenting the 2001 Harry S. Truman Good Neighbor Foundation Award to Kansas's own Senator Robert J. Dole.
I always hate to have people stand up if you always escape, but I'm very honored to be here today, and Cordell, I appreciate that introduction. It's the one I mailed out to you, and I'm pleased you're able to read it over a few times. But in any event, Truman was one of my heroes, and we toss that word around loosely, but he truly was. And I think, just as an aside, I wanted to, and I brought my Pepsi with me in case I got my first two dirty old man letters yesterday, and I wrote them back and said it was a dog barking, not me. But we've had a lot of fun doing some of these things, and since leaving politics, I decided to compile a couple of books. And the last one I compiled is titled A Great Political Wit, A Great Presidential Wit. And the subtitle is I Wish I Was in the Book, but I'm not. But what we did for the first time, they've ranked presidents on foreign policy, tax policy, oratorical ability, and all these other things. But no one has ever ranked presidents on who was the funniest and who was the least funny. And so we, four of us, tried to figure all this out. And of course, I didn't know all the presidents, but the ones I didn't know, Senator Thurman helped me with, because he had been an intern for George Washington and was in Jefferson's office and a few of those. And he's still there, as you know, at least, yes. But what we did, we sat down, we looked at a lot of material, and we started ranking from 1 to 41. At that time, we were still waiting for the outcome of the Florida election, and so we have a chapter called Waiting in the Wings, where we have Bush and Gore. And of course, if it sells enough to be reprinted, Gore will be no longer with us. But in any event, number one, you may be surprised, was Abraham Lincoln. And people say, Abraham Lincoln. But you go back and take a look at the time, take a look at the man, take a look at the personal tragedies in the family, the Civil War. And I believe that Lincoln used humor as a weapon, in a sense, as an instrument. Because otherwise, he said once, if he couldn't laugh, he would cry. And his humor was sort of like, he was called, somebody jumped up the audience one day and said, "You're two-faced." He said, "If you think I had another one, I'd use the one I have." And, that was a Lincoln humor. And I don't know how it'd be on the late night shows, but back in those days, it was pretty good. And keep in mind, they wrote their own stuff. They didn't have 8 or 9 joke writers. They didn't have the talk shows. They didn't have all the other things available that modern presidents have. And in this book, we rank Harry Truman number 7, which I think is pretty good. And out of the top 10, 5 are Republicans and 5 are Democrats, so it's pretty much bipartisan. The man right ahead of Harry Truman is Calvin Coolidge. And people, Calvin Coolidge, what did he ever say that was funny? Well, he was sort of a sarcastic guy. And just one quick example, he was seated next to a lady night at a state dinner, and she turned to him and said, "I bet my husband I could get you to say 3 words. He said, "You lose." And that was his humor. And probably the two who had the greatest delivery and timing were Jack Kennedy and Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan is ranked number 2. Reagan had this quality about him, this star quality. He'd walk into a room, and he had that little twinkle in his eye. He might not know all the names of the members of his cabinet or little things like that, but he understood that he was the President of the United States, and when he spoke, people listened. And because he had this self-deprecating sense of humor, he said one day, he said, "I've been getting a lot of flack lately since I ordered those B-1s. He said, how was I to know they were airplanes?" He said, "I thought they were vitamins for the troops." And so that's sort of the Ronald Reagan humor. But in any event, I won't go through all these because we don't have that much time, but I want to say some things about Harry Truman. But last, the one who was at least funny was Millard Fillmore. I didn't know Millard, but again, Senator Thurman said he had a lot of nice qualities. But Millard lived in Buffalo, New York, and it snows a lot in Buffalo. I don't think he got out a lot. And if he did, nobody wrote it down. The only thing of note that people remember about Fillmore is that he's the first president who suggested pensions for retired presidents. Now, had he included losers, I probably would have moved him up to, say, 25 or 24. But he only mentioned those who were successful. But in any event, it was a lot of fun doing the book, and this one belongs to Alvin. Alvin, that's your book. So, I want to thank Dennis and Karen for being here. Must not be any votes today, and that's a good thing for all of us taxpayers. So, and I'd like to have all the Truman relatives stand. I've met several cousins, and I know they're out there somewhere. Would they sort of stand up? Any Truman relatives? There's and plaques, but I can't think of many that would be more important to me as a Midwesterner than this one. And somebody used to stay at the Mulebach Hotel from time to time, the old Mulebach Hotel, and maybe even stay in the same room where the Truman piano was still around. And that was always exciting for somebody from Kansas, a newcomer to the United States Senate. And like, as was indicated by Judge Meeks, like Mr. Truman, I'm a plain-spoken man. A later generation might call both of us oratorically challenged, but Truman illustrated the point himself by telling a story of a politician who was scheduled to make a speech and who compared himself to attending his wife's funeral. At one point in the ceremony, the undertaker asked him if he would ride down the cemetery in the same car with his mother-in-law. They just buried his wife. He said, well, I can do it, but it's just going to spoil the whole day for me. Now, that's one of Harry's stories. But it wasn't what Harry Truman said or how he said it that causes Americans of both parties to revere the man from independence. Is it what he did and how he did it? My own admiration for President Truman has nothing to do with geography or partisan politics. It has everything to do with courage and vision and common sense. And above all, it's a matter of character. When you boil it all down, whatever we are, whatever we do in life, when you start measuring up somebody's success at the end of the road, it's going to come down to character. However far that Harry Truman traveled anywhere in the world, he never forgot where he came from or the values he learned in the American heartland. And according to Mr. Truman, three things could ruin a man. In his words, they were power, money, and women. I never wanted power, he said. I never had any money. And the only woman in my life is up at the house right now. And that's how he summed it up. And these days, the only woman in Harry Truman's life rests beside him in the courtyard of the magnificent library. And even as we gather today, as you all know, we're nearing completion of a new Truman Library. And again, it'll be a giant step forward as far as history is concerned. And I've asked myself, what would Harry Truman think today if he came on the scene and watched the nightly news or watched C-SPAN, watched the House or the Senate or the White House in action? What would Harry Truman do? For example, what would he make of our poll-driven politics or spin doctors and candidates who find their convictions in a focus group? Whatever it is, I'm certain it would be quotable, even if it wasn't necessarily printable. And in this area of political stagecraft, one reason why so many people admire Harry Truman is his authenticity. From his earliest days as a Jackson County judge, he never inhaled the hot air of political self-importance. Take it from one who knows. United States senators have always liked to hear the sound of their own voices. When I was there, 100 senators felt that way. That included me, of course. And Senator Truman was a rare exception to this windy rule. On first arriving in Washington, a colleague well versed in the folkways of Capitol Hill gave him the best advice he ever received, or so he claimed. As Truman recalled it, the older man took him aside and said, "Don't start out with an inferiority complex. For the first 6 months, you'll wonder how you got here. After that, you'll wonder how the rest of us got here." And that's pretty much the way I remember it, too. But Harry Truman knew that laughter was more than a safety valve. It supplied its own brand of perspective. As president, he would have to need all of the wisdom and the laughter he could summon. It's hard to imagine a more daunting situation confronting a new president than what he faced in the spring of 1945. In fact, he was sworn in on April 12, 1945, and I was wounded in Italy 2 days later. I don't think it had anything to do with the change in the White House, but 2 days later in Italy. So I remember that date very well. I remember the day that Roosevelt died. I remember the tears shed in the Italian mountains of all of us. We were not Democrats and Republicans. He was our commander-in-chief. We were young guys from Kansas and New York and California, all across America. But I think perhaps we look back on what Truman did, coming in as he did at a very critical time. He made some of the toughest decisions of the century, and subsequent events have more than vindicated his judgment. Is it any wonder that what our 33rd president would say about today's America, its politics, its priorities, and its place in the world? It's been mentioned I spent much of the last few years raising funds to build a long overdue monument on the Mall in Washington to honor what has been called the greatest generation. And I'd like to pause because I'd just like the World War II veterans to stand at this time. All the World War II veterans in the audience, if you'd please stand. Yeah, there we are. There's a real sense of urgency about this because we lose 1,200 World War II veterans every day. We've gone from 16.5 million plus to about 5 million. And now we're embroiled in a big bureaucratic snarl in Washington, D.C. It took 5 years to win the war. It's taken us 13 to try to get a memorial. And we were told just the other day we have to start over. We have to start over. I thought we saved the world. Now they're talking about saving them all. We saved them all. And everything else in the United States. I'm talking about the generation. And it's so frustrating. We've raised $170 million. We're ready to build the World War II memorial. And we were told last week, we're going to have to look at it again on June the 4th. And during that delay itself, 20-some thousand World War II veterans will expire. Now, these monuments aren't built for the World War II veterans. 2/3 are gone. But we would like to have a few there for the dedication, representing the millions of others, and not just those who wore the uniform, but those who worked in the factories, and those who worked on the farms, and those who worked in the shops, and the teachers, and the preachers, and the universities, and the schools would be represented. I think the World War II generation, called by Tom Brokaw the greatest generation, deserves a final salute. While they're still around, some are still around to receive it. We don't build memorials just to remember heroic deeds of a passing generation. We don't build them merely to commemorate what has been. We build them to inspire what might be in the future. All the young people here today from all over the world. And most of these countries look to the United States for leadership, whether it's moral or spiritual or whatever kind, they look to the United States. It was our hope that maybe this memorial might be an inspiration to your children of the World War II veterans, or their grandchildren, or generations yet to come, when they stand and reflect on what their father, their grandfather, their great-grandfather might have done in World War II. Because without it, there wouldn't be a mall. Somebody else would tell us what to think and when to think and what to do. We wouldn't be seated here today honoring the 33rd President of the United States unless somebody gave us permission. That's what World War II is all about. And I would hope that in our lifetime of many of those who stood today, we'll be able to say, well, there it is. it's finished. I sometimes think if Harry Truman were around, it would have been finished about 12 years ago, because he would have seen to it that we didn't forget America's veterans. He understood this. He served in one war, and few men had a better grasp of Nazi menace than the Nazi menace. Months before Pearl Harbor, he wrote, "We are facing a bunch of thugs." I mean, he was a plain-spoken man. And the only theory a thug understands is a gun and a bayonet. And of course, coming from the show-me state, he wanted to make certain that every gun and every bayonet was honestly produced and paid for. And troubled by reports of waste and inefficiency in defense production, Senator Truman went to the Roosevelt White House and offered his help in winning the war. He carried the same message to General George Marshall. But it didn't stop there. At age 56, Truman volunteered for active duty. And Marshall said, "You're too damned old. You better stay home and work in the Senate." And so he did. And between 1941 and 1944, the Truman Committee on Defense Production saved $10 billion and countless lives, and Truman more than fulfilled his pledge to President Roosevelt. He did help win the war, as much as any Pentagon strategist or some private in Italy or Guadalcanal or anywhere else. And in the process, Senator Truman showed himself to be a first-rate builder of consensus. And it's been my philosophy for years, if you can't find a consensus in the Congress, it's not going to last. I don't know of any partisan pieces of legislation that have stood the test of time. If there's not support from both major parties, in my view, it doesn't last very long. And Senator Truman understood this long before I came along. And what he did was nothing short of miraculous. He headed all this committee, and there was never a minority report filed. It was always unanimous. If Chairman Truman said it was right, everyone else agreed. Republicans or Democrats, it didn't make any difference. And he may have earned his name as Give 'em Hell Harry on the campaign, but the president never confused the art of governing with a permanent campaign. He had too much respect for the American people and too much reverence for the White House. He did so much to preserve, to convert it into a political war room day after day after day, month after month, and year after year. And at the dawn of the atomic age and the Cold War, he saw the need for a bipartisan foreign policy. And we hear talk of bipartisanship now, and we hopefully hope it's going to happen. It happened in the last administration to some degree. We hope it happens in this administration. Because above all other things, we're public servants, we're public servants. Democrats and Republicans, we're Americans first, and that's how Truman saw it. And let me just name a few people that he talked about. He even got former President Herbert Hoover was summoned out of political purgatory and dispatched on a round-the-world mission to avert post-war famine. John Foster Dulles negotiated a peace treaty with Japan to be serving at the United Nations. Robert Patterson became Secretary of War. Robert Leavitt became Defense Secretary. Senator Warren Austin of Vermont was named Ambassador to the UN. John J. McCloy was High Commissioner of occupied Germany. All Republicans, all in powerful positions, all put there by a Democratic president, the 33rd President of the United States, Harry Truman. And then perhaps there was his most famous appointment. It was exactly 50 years ago in April 1951 that General Dwight D. Eisenhower formally took command of Supreme Headquarters, Allied Powers, Europe. He went there at the direct request of the man Eisenhower regarded as one of the most important figures of the West, the father of NATO, the Marshall Plan, and the Truman Doctrine. And Truman and Eisenhower not only held the line against Soviet aggression, together they built the alliance that would for 4 decades later lead to dismantling of the Soviet Union itself. In the 1952 presidential campaign, each man said things about the other that would undermine their historic friendship. You know, politics does that sometimes. But the real test of a man is his ability to rise above such petty slights. And both Truman and Eisenhower passed that test, both here from the Midwest. As Steve Neal points out in his forthcoming book, Harry and Ike, it took Senator Harry Darby of Kansas and Kansas City's Joyce Hall to bring them together. Following the rededication of the Liberty Memorial, Ike visited this library where he got some ideas for his own in Abilene. They came together again at President Kennedy's funeral, where they indulged the prerogatives of age by reminiscing about all the history that they had made together. They came back together after this brief period. And what a conversation that must have been. What a story they shared for what freedom, when freedom was in peril, first from the Nazi tyranny and later from the Soviet aggression. It was Truman, it was Truman, it was Eisenhower who roused their countrymen from an isolationist slumber. To be sure, neither man lived to see the ugly walls which had divided the post-war continent crumble. Yet both could take solace in knowing that America's sacrifice and blood and treasure was not in vain. And historians will debate for the centuries who won the Cold War. Well, this much I know, that without Harry Truman, it could never even have been waged. He was an important figure. We talk about the giants of the time, the Churchills, the Trumans, the Marshalls, the Eisenhowers, and it's a remarkable period in our history. It is in this context that I ask, what would President Truman make of the new isolationists? Those who trash global trade for the benefit of television cameras, those who would build new walls to keep out foreign goods, even at the cost of preventing American goods from reaching foreign markets. Harry Truman was the right kind of protectionist. He would do whatever it took to protect American lives and American liberties. But he knew the world too well to delude himself into thinking it would leave the United States alone. Above all else, Truman understood that to lead is to choose, and one cannot choose isolation over engagement without risking both our leadership and our liberties. So I will just conclude by suggesting that there's never been a greater need for bipartisanship in American politics and in the Truman tradition. We have seen President Bush in recent weeks reach out. I think Dennis has been to the White House certainly more than I have. I'm trying to get down there someday, but in any event, I'm working on it. And Karen probably too. But this is a beginning. You know, we have a 50-50 Senate. You have to read the columns every morning to see who's going to control the Senate. Did something happen to somebody overnight? And if so, which party was he or she in? So you don't know till the next morning. And the House is almost divided. The country is evenly divided. And it's going to be a great test of George W. Bush, the 43rd President of the United States. And it's a time for some of that 33rd President's wisdom and bipartisanship. I read off just some of the names Truman turned to in the Republican Party. When he talked about bipartisanship, he meant and he understood what bipartisanship was all about. And maybe it's because of his service in the Congress. We've had President Bush, I think, react very well to the Chinese crisis. And we'll see what happens in the future, because it's very, very early. It's just starting his second 100 days this week. And the presidency is 4 years, and hopefully some would say 8 years. And some would, so some would willing to write the conclusion now, you can't do it this early. It's like creating a business. And as I said today in an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal, the most important thing is, who do you surround yourself with? What kind of people do you associate with? What kind of people do you have in your business? What kind of people do you have in your cabinet if you're the President of the United States? And do people like you? Do they like your wife? Do they like the people you appoint? And that's half the battle. And it's one that certainly President Truman understood. And so it's easy to sort of define our policy when it comes to the giants like China or Russia. But when you talk about other parts of the world, the support sort of drops off dramatically. And I just conclude by mentioning the Balkans. I served President Clinton for 3 years as chairman of a commission nobody's ever heard of, the International Commission on Missing Persons. You know, about 40,000 people in Serbia and Bosnia and Croatia and later the province of Kosovo just disappeared off the face of the earth. They were primarily men between the age of 7 and 70. In most cases, they were taken from their homes, they were starved, they were tortured, they were executed, and dumped in mass graves. Something we said we'd never permit after the great genocide in the World War II era. And so our job was to go to the families, meet with the families, and see if we could identify the remains so families could bring closure, just as families tried to do after the Vietnam War in the United States. And I must say we made some progress, but there's a lot of progress yet to make. But I want to make just one point. I was the chairman. There were 5 other countries involved. It was a very small budget. We would meet in Serbia. I met twice with Serbian mothers. We tried to get Milosevic to meet with the mothers. He would even meet with mothers who had lost sons fighting for Milosevic. We were in Bosnia, as I said, we were in Croatia, and we were in Kosovo. Now these women, mostly women, had nothing but the dress on their back. They had no material goods. They had really no future at all. They had a dress on their back. And I'll tell you one true story that happened on my last trip. I was in Pristina, Kosovo, and I was asked if I would meet with this family. And there were 6 women and 1 man, and we met for about 45 minutes, and they told me with tears running down their cheeks this true story. On May 10, 1999, there was a knock at the door. All the men were ordered out, or all the women were ordered out, and all the men were ordered to stay in the house. There were 25 people living in one little house. They didn't have any weapons. They weren't after anybody. They weren't causing any trouble. 2 were engineers. 2 of the young men were students, 1 in a psychology major, 1 in something else. And they were all taken away. And the women were not permitted to come back for 3 days. And when they come back, they couldn't find anyone except they found bloodstains. And to this day, unless their husbands are released just the last couple of weeks from Serbian jails, they do not know what happened to their loved ones. But this is the point. It's not the point that I was on the commission. They had heard the name Bob Dole. They didn't know whether Bob Dole was a Republican or a Democrat, and it didn't make any difference. They knew that Bob Dole was an American. And I can't tell you how much credibility we have in almost every country of the world. This lady was telling me about her husband, and through the tears, she in effect said, "We know you will find my husband and my sons and my neighbors' husbands because you're an American." Now think about that. You talk about credibility. And they weren't talking about presidents or congressmen or former senators. They were talking about the American people, people in this audience, and what you represent and what you do on a daily basis to help your fellow man. Just the fact that somebody was there from America, somebody from America cared about their problem, they expect miracles will follow. And we hope they do. And that story could be repeated dozens and dozens of times in Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, most of them missing were Bosnians, or anywhere in the world. When America says, yes, we will help, people listen. We have the great respect, as I said, of almost every nation. And we have to remember it from time to time because we sort of take everything for granted. Think of some of these people who for 71 years didn't have the right to worship, they didn't have the right to vote, they couldn't make a phone call without somebody listening in, they couldn't get on an airplane and travel. All these basic things that we take for granted. And some of the young people who stood here today could tell us even more about it because they come from countries where their parents and their grandparents were made to suffer for years. So I guess if Harry Truman were here today, he would marvel at the progress we've made in civil rights. He would marvel at the progress we made in feeding the hungry. He would marvel at the progress we've made in many, many areas. He would be disappointed, I think, about all the money going into politics. He would be disappointed about all the other things I mentioned earlier. But he was a winner. And he understood leadership. And he understood leadership without responsibility is not leadership at all. And he understood values like honor, duty, and country, and like honesty and decency and accountability are not just words. And said, I've had people tell me, Bob, those things that's 50 years ago. I said, no, it's probably 500 or 5,000 years ago. These are enduring values. They don't go away, as Bob Meneely could tell us. They'll be there for 500 years in the future, and hopefully 500 after that. And so I'm very honored to be here to pay tribute to the memory of our 33rd president. He was a great leader, and we toss that word around a lot. He was, in a sense, an American hero, though heroes, and he risked his life in World War I, so he would qualify as a hero, not a celebrity. He was a hero. He understood America. He understood the working man and the working woman. He understood people that needed, why people sometimes need help and sometimes needs to look to the federal government. He understood the greatness of America. He understood the need for a strong defense and a strong foreign policy, and not mincing your words when the times were tough. He understood that stability is a vital American interest, and he also understood that prevention of future slaughter is a moral imperative, wherever it may occur. So thank you very much for this honor, and I say just God bless America and God bless Harry Truman.